I'm Bambi Francisco. A lean approach to starting a company is a popular discipline these days. That's thanks to Eric Ries, who's been preaching this methodology and gaining a large following. Joining me to talk about this lean startup model is Eric Ries. He is the author of the blog Startup Lessons Learned, and prior to that, he co-founded InView. Eric, thank you for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You have an all-day conference coming up this Friday, and it's built around this idea of the lean startup, and we'll talk about how you plan to get this point across. It seems rather simple. Basically, don't spend money. But there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about the concept of the lean startup is it's actually not about how much money you spend. It's what you spend the money on. So the lean and lean startup doesn't refer to being cheap. It actually takes its inspiration from lean manufacturing, where one of the consequences of changing the way that we work does mean that we can do a lot more with less, so it's getting better value for every dollar that we spend in a startup. But actually, once you know what you're spending money on and understand the value you're getting from those dollars, in a lot of cases you can spend a lot more money because you can spend it better, and because you know what you're spending it on, you can raise a lot more money. So it's it's a little bit counterintuitive. People think lean startup, that means don't spend money on anything, but actually being cheap is not necessarily good for entrepreneurs.
Oh, okay. That's very convenient. No wonder you need an entire conference to talk about it.
That's right. That's right. And the Startup Lessons Learned conference will be April 23rd in San Francisco. The website is sllconf.com.
So to talk a little bit about some of the principles then that go into this idea of the lean startup, if it's not just not spending money. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, it's really important to know when to spend money. So in a lot of cases, especially you saw this during the dot-com era, but it's still pretty much endemic in Silicon Valley and in a lot of startup hubs. We have an idea, we kind of paint a fantastical vision of something really cool. We raise significant money, we do a massive launch when the product is finally ready, and then we hope that customers will come and do the things that the business plan that we wrote maybe 2-3 years ago said that they were going to do. In those cases, if the idea is wrong in some way, or our strategy of executing that idea is wrong, then we spend the money and it's game over. So it's kind of you live or die. You basically get one giant swing of the bat. What we're trying to do with the lean startup is get entrepreneurs into a place where the failure of an idea doesn't have to mean the failure of the whole company. So before we spend a massive amount of money on launch and publicity and driving growth, first we spend a lot less money. We have a much lower burn rate, and we try to prove that the idea works in what we call microscale. And then once we've shown that the unit economics of the business make sense, then we'll be in a much better place to raise money and spend money on customer acquisition, on becoming the market leader. But we used to have this idea that first mover advantage was everything for startups. But if you look at the history of successful technology companies, often it's the fast follower that wins, except sometimes when it is the first mover. So how do you know the dynamics of the specific market that you're in, what the right thing to do is? The whole point of lean startup is when you're still small, spend more time learning, less time just doing linear execution. What you're learning about is what kind of market am I in? Who is the customer? What problem do I need to solve for them? And the purpose of all that is not so that then you can stay small. The purpose is still to be able to grow a significant company, but really know how to spend the money to do that growth in a higher success environment.
That is a really, really tough discipline for somebody. I mean, some people think that when they raise money, I've raised $5 million, I need to spend it.
That's right. That's right. Mike Maples, who's one of the I think leading lean startup investors, has this phrase that no matter how much money you raise, your runway will wind up being 18 months, because you can't raise money and not spend it. That's contradictory to the purpose of what your investors want. If they wanted the money to sit in the bank, they could have just done that themselves. So the question is not how much runway do you get. It's what do you do with that runway? How much learning do you get in those 18 months? And the problem with a kind of linear execution mindset is you're not really learning, you're selling. You're telling customers that they should buy this thing. And then if you actually look at what causes startups to succeed or fail, I think shocking percentage are companies that turn out to be building something that basically nobody wants. They can get the 10,000 early adopters in Silicon Valley to use their products.
But these are companies who fail. They're building. Well, that seems logical.
I mean, when you think about it, sure. But we still organize our companies in Silicon Valley as if the real question was a technology risk question, right? Like if you're inventing a cure for cancer, you don't have to ask yourself, will anybody want the cure for cancer? Obviously, there'll be a huge market for that if only it can be built. Now, of course, if anyone knew how to do a cure for cancer, I hope they're working on it. And, and the question is, will it survive FDA trials? Will it have the intended, pharmacological effect, et cetera? So in software, certainly, but in most industries where we're doing high-tech innovation, when was the last time someone pitched you a new social network and you said, boy, can that be built? Of course it can be built. The bigger question is, should it be built?
Right.
Does anybody want it? And in particular, we treat these things like they're binary, but of course they're not binary. There's actually, a lot of things that have to go right in order for a company to be successful.
Right.
Which elements of your vision turn out to be brilliant predictions about the future, and which ones are crazy delusions?
Right, right.
But that's what we have to figure out.
That's to figure out. But, you see all these entrepreneurs who look at other entrepreneurs getting funded for similar ideas.
Yes.
So they say, well, it's got to be, they just got, $3 million, they got $5 million, but they need encouragement that they could actually do it with $200,000, because there are companies who can do it that way too. Now, do you encourage? What if startups do get several $1 million? And there's many who, I was just speaking with Jim Lanzone, who took another, $11 million or so, something like that, and he said, I didn't need it, just put it in the bank. How do you put it in the bank when the investors want you to spend it?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, fundraising is a specialized topic, and whether to do it or not and when to do it, I think actually Venture Hacks is kind of the #1 resource on like the mechanics of how to raise money and when and how to do the pitch. But the hardest thing to do with venture investing is to make sure that the entrepreneur and the venture investor are as aligned as possible. To make sure that they, before the money's in the bank, have a shared commitment to the same kind of values and the same plan, which is why, especially if you want to go to the lean startup model, where you might not be spending money in the ways that a lot of traditional venture investors expect, you really want to make sure you've got that synchronized.
What do the investors think about your lean startup model? Do you have many people who want to back some of your companies, or some of the entrepreneurs who are...
So when I first started talking about this stuff in public, like a year and a half ago, most people thought I was crazy. I mean, I had quite a few VCs and just all kinds of people, entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, just say, that's nuts. Why would anybody do that? And some of the specific techniques of the lean startup sound a little bit crazy when you're used to the older model, like this thing called continuous deployment, where we'll put software into production 50 times a day. In the traditional model, that's just nuts. Why would you ever do that?
Yeah.
And for VCs, it has taken some kind of rethinking of when is the right time to put in money and what are the indicators of traction that matter. But I do think there's now a class of VCs that are really specializing in these kind of early stage lean startup investments.
Who are they?
Well, we've been really lucky to have 3 of the best as sponsors of the conference. So Floodgate Capital used to be Maple's Investments. First Round Capital and Steve Anderson at Baseline have been really enthusiastic adopters of this model. And if you look at the companies they're funding, you'll see this pattern in them, because they've figured out that what makes startups, the way to get a competitive advantage in these highly uncertain market-driven sectors, like consumer internet, like social networks, like increasingly even software and enterprise, software as a service, hardware. So there's kind of a continuum of level of uncertainty, how much market risk versus technical risk. On the extreme end, costs are coming way down. So the kind of number of experiments you can run for $100,000, $200,000, $300,000. It's
a lot.
I mean, it's a lot compared to even 5 years ago. When we started InView, it took us 6 months to get our first version of the product out in full public beta.
Yeah.
I mean, we were charging people money 6 months after.
And this was how many years ago?
This is in 2004.
Yeah.
And we thought, wow, that's really impressive. 6 months only cost us, $500,000 to do that.
Yeah.
We thought we were being really lean and really fast. But today, if you took 6 months to get your first version of a product like that, I'd say, what do you spend all that time doing?
Yeah.
And even us, who had really explicitly tried to build this thing we call the minimum viable product, which is do the least amount of work possible, when we shipped that product 6 months later, customers wouldn't download it. And so it was like really buggy and early, and had all these problems.
You couldn't do it then, but you could do it today.
Well, what I'm trying to say is, even though we thought we had done the minimum, actually we had built way too much.
Oh, wow.
Because we had argued for hours about all of the later stages of how will they pay for it and this button and should we fix this bug or not, and most customers never even discovered those bugs.
Wow.
Because we couldn't get them through the early part of the download, sign up, get your avatar created. This is 3D avatar, so there's a lot of stuff that had to happen.
Right.
And so I had this realization back then that the way I had been measuring progress was how many lines of code did I write. I was the head of engineering, right? That was my idea.
That's so funny. I've been in a conversation with some people who've said, how many lines of code have you written? And it's almost like an author. It's like, how many words have you written? Well, it doesn't matter if you've written thousands of words.
The best writers kill words
yeah,
all the time.
Gettysburg Address was, what, 250 words or whatever it is. So your conference, how many people do you expect at this conference?
We're pretty close to capacity, so I think we're going to be a couple hundred people. And actually, we've allowed startup organizations around the world to simulcast it for people who can't travel to San Francisco. So I think we're up to like 40 or 50 cities on 6 continents. So the extended global audience for this is really, that's been the most surprising thing to me, that there is this community that's become quite global.
And it's great that they get to watch it. So do you plan on more of these events?
I think so. I mean, one thing at a time. I'm trying to figure out,
you gotta make sure
my mission has been to change the way that startups get built. And so I think of what I'm doing now as a startup. What are the products, what are the channels, who's the customer, and what are the mechanisms that actually effectively help people to change their behavior? Because I think I have a moral objection to the kind of waste of human potential that the old model in startups represents.
I like that.
It drove me crazy as an entrepreneur to see people waste sometimes years of their lives building something that fundamentally nobody wants. It's like, really? We couldn't double check to just make sure we weren't on a completely crazy path?
Right, right.
And I think if we could stop that on an industrial scale, really good things can happen.
Well, that's good. That's your, I'm a convert. I'm following your philosophy, and I would be at your conference if I weren't in London, heading to London. So, but I think you guys should definitely go, and you're going to stick around. We're going to talk about the mechanisms. We're going to talk about what you mentioned, continuous deployment, minimum viable product, and a number of other principles that go into this lean startup methodology. Thanks, Eric.
Hey, thank you.
I've been speaking with Eric Ries. I'm Dan B. Francisco.